You're watching The New Stack Makers, a podcast for people who develop, deploy, and manage at-scale software. For more information and articles about at-scale technologies, please visit thenewstack.io. Now enjoy the show. For those not aware, earlier this year, Hacked had all the signs of a state actor effort to infect the software supply chain took place. What we do know has been well documented and has come to illustrate why a labor shortage and lack of support for open source maintainers is forcing the industry to come to grips with an approach that for decades has depended on volunteers to maintain projects that are vital to commercial software development. So my question is, who is Jetan? I believe that's how you pronounce his name. And how did it impact trust in the open source community? And how did the OpenJS Foundation get a glimpse into this new dimension of attacks? I'm talking specifically about the XZ utility incident, which is now, in this article in Cyberscoop, is really talking about how it served as a new point for us to really think about. And I'm here with Robin Ginn, is executive director of the OpenJS Foundation. And Robin is quoted quite a bit in that story. And what really was the significance of that attack? And then maybe we could talk about what you discovered.
Yeah, I think the significant was that it's what we're understanding is it's likely not an isolated incident, these social engineering attacks, and most probably not by an individual person. Obviously, the XZ utils had the one person identified. In our case, we saw multiple, GitHub IDs, overlapping emails, avatars, and things like that. But they are real people behind probably some bad actor somewhere who is not only getting close to understanding the code, but they're also understanding how our open source communities work.
And so that incident happened, and it, even in the software industry, which kind of just brushes off kind of attacks often, it's because they, for so many years been focused on just development. This one hit a chord. What do you think it hit? What chord do you think it hit?
Trust. Trust is not security. Of course, development, but security has always been critical for any kind of developer, any sort of engineer. But when you hand over the keys to your kingdom, your GitHub repository, you need to trust the people who are accepting changes to your code base. So I think we found, trust is not security, which I think we already knew, but it really hit home.
And so then what did you discover sooner after that? I remember seeing you at the Open Source Summit, and there was a blog post that came out just around that time in which you found a similar incident happening. Right.
I think, the JavaScript communities are very much volunteer-led as opposed to some corporate-led open source projects. And of course, they're overwhelmed. And we're always trying to recruit new contributors. And so you get emails all the time, and you have contributions all the time, and those are very welcome. And I think it wasn't until the XZ publicity came out that there was a series of emails that sort of came through our organization that sort of triggered that spidey sense that maybe something was a little off. And I think it was them asking for admin privileges to take over a project. And that, is just something that usually takes some time to, earn, I would say.
So what are some of those resource challenges that the OpenJS Foundation faces?
There's a couple of things. Some of our projects have been around for some time. I mean, Node.js, jQuery, Webpack. A lot of these projects have been around 10, 15, 20 years. And so either you have a small group of maintainers or sometimes even one maintainer, which is pretty common for JavaScript. I think if you look at some other open source projects, they require 3 maintainers and double checks. JavaScript as a whole has a lot of single maintainers. And again, JavaScript maintainers typically are volunteers, and that's our experience.
Mm-hmm.
At least on the contribution side.
Right. And so really those maintainers are either employees of a company, and so they get paid by their employer, or they're volunteers, just purely volunteers, right?
Yes. Look at,
yeah.
And we do have some company projects where companies are quite generous in dedicating time. We have Red Hat, who has a couple of people who work part of their day job is to support the Node.js project, and that's fantastic. Microsoft and Slack have employees contributing to Electron. But I would say probably 90% of our contributors are volunteers. So that's kind of the nights and weekend, based on passion.
Is this a sign that the system is broken? That it's just, to rely on volunteers like we do with just the thousands of projects that are out there?
No, I mean, I'm still a big believer in open source, and I think that's you're going to have more secure projects, or you're going to have more innovation happening when communities are freely enabled to do, what's best through openly governed projects. So I just think we're sort of at this tipping point where, everybody's using open source. And I think if you're using open source, that you should be able to use and contribute as part of your core job.
So you're of the belief that open source is still critical, and that we need it for innovation purposes. But should those maintainers be paid by the corporations that are using the software?
The best way to pay an open source maintainer is definitely to hire them, give them a full engineering role or documentation or marketing. There's lots of ways to contribute if you're in the US with benefits, and go with that. I think if we continue down the crowdfunding, I think that's wonderful. It could be, but I don't think it's enough to fully sustain an open source maintainer full time.
But companies are in many cases cutting back their engineering, and the labor gap is dividing further. So what's their solution then?
Definitely alarming for sure. And so we'll probably continue to see people who have the passion for open source continue to develop that. But hopefully, as open source usage becomes more mainstream, that will encourage companies to be more mainstream, because they may be cutting back open source programs offices, but again, every piece of software, almost nearly every piece of software, includes some sort of open source. So again, if it can be normalized as not a open source thing, but just an engineering way of work, I think that would be the best way to go.
But the commercial software users have often been asked to contribute to open source, but they are of the view that the commercial software companies that are members of foundations are getting paid are getting the privilege of developing the software under their under whatever mark they have, and so they're not really as willing to contribute. What do we need to do to encourage more users to contribute, or what are the systematic things that we need to do?
So, I mean, there's more to a successful open source project than code. I mean, code is huge, right? It's very important. So we need these developers getting paid somehow. We have infrastructure costs to deliver that software. That's something for us that we take on that burden, but we're very fortunate to have partners to provide free CDN services and other infrastructure like Cloudflare, DigitalOcean, Vercel. But we still need more. We have legal from all of the IP and trademarks. We have marketing. We have the websites. We have community engagement. You need people to organize all of that. So That's where companies and governments, contributing back to these projects are helping keep projects more innovative, yes, but also more secure. And that's been our experience.
JavaScript is used in almost every website in the world, practically. I mean, well, not every website, but it's sure used by a lot of them. I think in the article in Cyberscoop, you said that JavaScript is essentially in 99% of the world's websites.
That's right.
Because you need to make your website interactive. And that makes it, the front door for most companies. What are you trying to do to help these companies keep their, JavaScript, environments clean of attacks like this? And and then maybe you could talk a little bit about what you're doing with jQuery.
Yeah, we've talked about some contributions back to our foundation, and we have a couple of grants. We have government grants from the German government, the Sovereign Tech Fund, and we have Alpha Omega, which is an affiliate of the Open Source Security Foundation. Alpha Omega gave us funding to really understand web security. And so we hired IDC, Al Gillen, prominent analyst, open source, led that body of work with their security and DevOps teams. We found that 750 million websites are out of date. Just if you think about using jQuery as kind of the canary in the coal mine, essentially thinking if your jQuery is out of date, it's probably everything else is probably out of date behind your website as well. And if your website's out of date, you're much more vulnerable to security and privacy risks. In fact, I think we had, of those respondents, a third cited security incidents in the last 2 years. So pretty significant. So we launched a healthy web checker tool for companies to take a look to see if their websites were out of date. And then just on the jQuery side, we launched some ways to sort of upgrade and migrate your websites.
So what are you seeing from this?
We are seeing, I don't know, have you taken a look at your website, Alex?
It's we're doing a lot of redevelopment right now.
Yeah, so I would recommend you go to healthyweb.org, plop in your website. It's not just, we're finding on the web checker with jQuery, we have data behind the Node.js project as well. 2/3 of users are on old Node.js as well. So really kind of across the board, people are not doing the upgrades. We try to do as much communication as we can. And we've also created a new partner program called the Ecosystem Sustainability Project or program, where we're trying to help end users kind of provide a bridge if you're on an old or outdated version, to provide that support and then educate people to move to a newer version. And we partnered with, our first partner is Hero Devs, and they do a great job of helping people bridge that gap.
So what is what's the next step in what OpenJS is doing, and kind of like as part of this narrative to help people prevent problems?
We're working with partners. If you look at GoDaddy is a member of ours, and so they're providing a bridge to the WordPress community, which is quite big. WordPress does a great job now of including updated jQuery, but that was only up until like a few years ago. So if you're on an older version and you haven't updated, whether it's WordPress or anything else, for example, that GoDaddy is hosting, you might look at your communication from either GoDaddy or Automatic to find out if your website's out of date. And then, of course, we're working with developers all of the time, being very transparent about the release cycles, to have some predictability, to let end users and developers know what's supported, what's not, what's experimental, what's not. So we really encourage folks to look. You can look to our social sites. You can look to GitHub, the Node sites as well, and jQuery to understand.
One thing that you talked about in the CyberScoop article, which is interesting to me, are the financial impacts that these vulnerabilities and these, and just the lack of labor ability to kind of keep projects updated and supported. You talk a little bit about the financial challenges. Can you talk a little bit about how that's challenged OpenJS Foundation and what that means?
Yeah, I mean, if you look, we are a part of the Linux Foundation family, and we love the Linux Foundation, but there's several open source foundations under the Linux Foundation. So sometimes we find that as new foundations or kind of use case scenarios open up, you almost end up competing for support, corporate support, government support for those projects. So whether it's, I call it sort of the bright shiny penny syndrome, where companies want to fund, for example, AI, but maybe not JavaScript, because that's just, it's become kind of commoditized a little bit, but absolutely still important.
Absolutely still important. Right. So, but you talked about how you did receive this grant for about 800,000 euros from Germany's Sovereign Tech Fund in March 2023. But are these grants enough?
No, they're not enough. And sometimes they can create new dependencies because you go after a grant to create a new program, and then you still need budget to sustain that program. I think I talked in that article, the German government grant almost doubled our budget. Whereas if you maybe look at other foundations, they may have 10, 20, $30 million budgets. We have 35 open source projects and only 2 full-time staffers working to support those projects and those volunteers. So again, is it enough? We're doing things that we hope have some longevity. We're doing free JavaScript training, security training. We're creating documentation and best practices. There's a ton of security information out there that I think may be overwhelming. So we're customizing that for JavaScript developers.
Again, this kind of gets back to almost like you're in the same position as essentially, I mean, there's a correlation between what you face and what the maintainers face. There's just a lack of funding. And, and that then creates its own like set of issues. I mean, the article states that you are basically just running year to year on grant money that you receive.
We do. It's have grant money, have corporate support. But again, it's definitely not enough. And we would love for our maintainers to get the support they need as well. Half of the money that we received from the Sovereign Tech Fund was infrastructure support. And if you look at some of the infrastructure for a 10 or 15-year-old project, it's really an archaeological dig. It's handshake deals. It's who has access. We talk about sort of the wobbly machines in someone's closet, wasn't quite that bad, but we really wanted to get everything current, modern, consolidate some of those vendors and handshake deals, and kind of get a handle on that. And we could not have done that without the Sovereign Tech Fund.
It's interesting if you look back, over the past 20 years or so, and that was really the value of open source, and, that it basically allowed companies to build software very quickly, using components that were built by people. And, and the Linux Foundation basically, could emerge as a real force by providing that ability to kind of help maintain these projects and help find the right supporters for the projects. And those supporters then got, their own benefits out of it. Do we need to change the system? Does this reflect at all on the, OpenJS and the Linux Foundation and the system that you need to think about for your own organization?
To change the system,
meaning like finding a way to like move the model from, because like what happens, at least is what it seems to me, is like, and I've talked about this, people's like the open source maintainer might build a project, right? Let's just say that's true, right?
Mm-hmm.
That project then takes on a life of its own, right? It grows in popularity, right? And then what happens, maybe then a foundation comes along, it could be the Linux Foundation, OpenJS, whoever, and they then find board members for the project. And then they incorporate that, the technology from the open source project into their own commercial offerings. And then, and the maintainer, unless they work for a company, then, needs to find their own ways of supporting themselves. Now, and that saved, that saved a lot of time for the commercial providers. It saved a lot of resources for them. And so I'm wondering, do you think, and that's been helpful to help, the open source policy efforts mature, the OpenJS, Linux Foundation, work with people who are leaders in open source. They may not necessarily be developers, but they're leaders in the open source community. And I just wonder if there needs to be kind of a reexamination of that model, to bring back more of the equity to the maintainer, so we can have a healthier ecosystem.
Yeah. Well, what I hear from some of our end users and some of our members. So, for example, we have a highly regulated financial institution. When they look at using an open source project, they will look to a project hosted at a foundation. It sort of future proofs it. It's the neutrality. You're signing contributions over, but they're contributing back, right? Not just as a member, but through code. So I think that's still a model that really works. But I think where it sort of breaks is when you have companies building billion-dollar businesses, literally billion-dollar businesses, not contributing back. We need, I think, more governments contributing, just like Germany has, because it really is sort of the digital infrastructure of our economy everywhere, and it's very connected. So I think, again, the foundation model is a good one because it is a neutral place for the sort of the long-term sustainability of these projects.
What about government? Does government need to be more involved to help find some equity here? I mean, would life be easier with government involved more so than they are now?
I think they would on the investment. If you take a look back to, it's like the Obama administration when they invested billions in electronic health records. That's where we saw, again, that the industry was sort of shifting, and they really needed to sort of invest heavily in that. So if you think about, you pay your taxes, you interact with your schools, the financial economies everywhere, that all requires software where you're using open source. And so, I went to an OECD event this year and spoke with a lot of government agencies, and it's really being led by the security professionals, which I think is pretty interesting. And what we'd like to see again is more governments contributing, like the Sovereign Tech Fund. They invest in the infrastructure, right? The roads, the highways. Think about it as, Fiona, who is one of the co-founders of the Sovereign Tech Fund. She'll say, would you want volunteers building your bridges? Well, you might get a volunteer to come build a bridge because they might be a really great architect or civil engineer, and that's super cool. So they want something for their portfolio. But 5-10 years down the road, who wants to fix the decay, the cracks in that bridge as your citizens are driving over it? So that's kind of the philosophy behind the Sovereign Tech Fund, is the innovation is happening all around with the developers, but they're really investing deeply in the infrastructure of these projects.
Yeah. It's really quite the paradox, isn't it? Because, we could say, like, at what point do we actually hurt open source? I think that's part of what I'm hearing is like, there was I know that in the article, they quoted Brian Fox, who's co-founder and CTO at Sonatype. And he says Fox also helps run Apache Maven. It's a build automation tool for Java projects primarily. And, there's a lot of money that's required, but even that endless cash is not going to automatically improve open source projects. Software development is about the process itself. And so there's a lot to balance here in the meantime. I imagine has to be part of your long-term discussion. It's not just the financial matters, but how can you make open source safe without destroying open source,
Right.
itself?
Well, I mean, just being part of the open source communities and projects, it's really magical to watch. I mean, yes, you have governance in place, so decisions are documented on how they're made, but really company lines, country lines, they just disappear. And
Yeah,
you become
you do.
a community, just like you
Right.
would with your neighborhood or your school. And it is really, again, a wonderful thing to see. You would even watching new projects spin out. We had Fastify spun out with Matteo, who is also quoted in that story. And
Right.
just by being active in the OpenJS Foundation, the relationships there, just really accelerated that project for new contributors. So it's really fun to watch these new projects spin out. It's really fun to see projects like Node, Webpack, even the small ones, MVM, WebDriver, just really do, just really cool, innovative things, just through this community engine that just runs.
Robin, I could talk to you for another hour or more on this topic. It's really interesting one. You're in such a interesting place, in your role there to be right at the center of all this between, new government regulation coming down the pipe and the threats from nation states, the challenges of dealing with corporate, both customers and funders, so good luck, in all this you work. It's good to see you in this role, and
Thank
we're happy
you.
to have you on the show. So
It's
thank you.
the best job in the world. It keeps me up at night, but I love it every day. I love our community. So
Great. Well, thanks for your time.
yeah, thanks, Alex.
If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can always subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're on all the major social media platforms. You can always find us at thenewstack.io. We hope to see you soon.